I never thought I would come home from vacation to find nothing but ruins. My family's old mansion, a legacy of over a century, had been bulldozed by the HOA. And standing there, with a smug smile, Karen Thompson said coldly, "Looks better, huh?" Did she think I would let it go? Her biggest mistake wasn't destroying my house. It was leaving me standing here. I never liked the HOA, the Homeowners Association, but I never imagined they could be this ruthless. I lived in Evergreen Estates, a prestigious neighborhood advertised as an ideal place to live, with luxurious homes, clean streets, and a peaceful environment. But that was just the facade. Beneath its polished exterior was a corrupt system, where the HOA controlled everything, from house colors, window designs, even to the height of fences. And at the top of that tyrannical empire was Karen Thompson, a power-hungry, ruthless woman. Karen and I had never gotten along. From the day my family moved in, she had an obvious disdain for us. She hated my house. Not because it was ugly or out of place, but because it was too unique. My mansion stood apart from every other house in the neighborhood. It was over 120 years old, built in a stunning neoclassical European style. Intricately carved pillars, stained glass windows with vibrant colors, and towering domes that carried historical significance. This wasn't just a home, it was a family heirloom, a part of the city's history, officially recognized as a National Historic Landmark. But to Karen, it was just an obstacle. I still remember the first time she visited, just a few days after I moved in. With a fake smile, she said, "Your house is quite unique. But have you considered remodeling it to better fit the modern style of Evergreen Estates?" I laughed dismissively and refused outright. And from that moment, Karen began an endless harassment campaign against me. I started receiving absurd violation notices from the HOA. Non-compliant paint color, even though the house had the original color from over a century ago. Windows not conforming to neighborhood design, even though they were historic stained glass with significant artistic value. Fence too high, yet it was shorter than several others in the community. When I refused to comply, the fines started piling up. I wasn't foolish enough to let the HOA bully me, so I hired a lawyer, took the case to the city council, and won. Since my house was a protected landmark, the HOA had no legal authority to force me to change anything. Karen was furious but powerless. And that was when she started plotting to destroy me completely. A few months later, my family and I took an extended vacation to Italy, enjoying peaceful days on the Amalfi Coast. Little did I know, the moment we boarded the plane, Karen made her move. She ordered my mansion to be demolished. Taking advantage of the fact that I didn't post a landmark protection notice in front of my house, because I didn't think it was necessary, Karen forged legal documents, claiming that my house violated building regulations and had to be torn down immediately. She hired a demolition crew, bringing in excavators and bulldozers at dawn, while the neighborhood was still asleep. In just one day, my mansion was reduced to rubble. The grand neoclassical columns were crushed under bulldozer tracks. The stained glass windows shattered into thousands of colorful fragments. Furniture, antiques, family photos, priceless books, all completely destroyed. Karen thought I wouldn't be able to do anything once it was gone. 2 weeks later, my family returned, excited and refreshed. I still remember the exact moment. As the car turned onto our street, something felt off. As we got closer, I noticed a strange empty space. And when the car stopped in front of what used to be my mansion, my heart plummeted into a bottomless abyss. There was nothing left. No domes. No doors. No stone walls. Only a barren lot, littered with debris, charred wood, and broken glass sparkling under the afternoon sun. I was paralyzed. My wife screamed in horror, our children burst into tears. And when I turned around, I saw Karen Thompson standing across the street, arms crossed, smirking in satisfaction. "Looks much better, doesn't it? Now you can rebuild something that actually fits the community." At that moment, rage flooded every vein in my body. I walked up to her, my voice icy cold. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." But Karen laughed mockingly. "What are you going to do? Sue me? I am the law here. If you don't like it, you can leave." She had no idea who she was dealing with. I took a deep breath, locked eyes with her, and said, "Karen, I promise you this. You will regret ever existing." She destroyed my house. Now, I was going to destroy her entire HOA. Karen thought she could use her HOA power to destroy anyone who didn't comply with her will. But she forgot one crucial detail. My mansion was a National Historic Landmark. This meant white heavy checkmark, it was protected by the federal government. White heavy checkmark, any demolition without approval from the National Historic Preservation Office was a serious crime. White heavy checkmark, the penalty: up to 10 years in prison and millions in fines. The best part? Karen had no idea. I had intentionally not posted a landmark notice in front of my home because I never thought anyone would be stupid enough to touch it. But now, that very oversight had turned into the perfect trap for Karen. She thought she had won. In reality, she had just put her own head on the chopping block. The next morning, I drove straight to the National Historic Preservation Office. As soon as I entered, I dropped a thick file on the desk of Michael Graves, the lead federal investigator for my district. "I want to report a serious crime. A federally protected landmark has been illegally demolished." Graves raised an eyebrow and opened the file. But the moment he saw the name of the property, its address, and the before and after photos of my mansion, his face turned pale. "Dear God, who did this?" Karen Thompson, president of the Evergreen Estates HOA. He didn't speak for 10 seconds. Then, without another word, he picked up his phone and called the Department of Justice. At that moment, I knew Karen had just crossed into territory she could never control. Before federal agents could step in, I decided to set a little trap for Karen myself. That evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting at the neighborhood community center. I knew Karen would be bragging about her so-called victory, so I took advantage of the moment to publicly expose her. I walked in among hundreds of residents, just as Karen stood at the podium, flashing her signature fake smile. "Today, we're here to discuss plans for replacing the old, outdated house that once occupied this lot." A small group of her loyal cronies applauded. Karen continued, "I have already spoken with a construction company, and we are proposing to turn the empty lot into a beautiful community park." A park? I almost laughed. I knew exactly what Karen was planning. She had no intention of building a park. She was going to sell the land to her husband's real estate company to develop high-end townhomes, making millions in profit. But before she could go any further, I stood up and walked toward the stage. "Excuse me, I have a question." Karen froze for a second, but quickly recovered. "Mr. Winters, this is not the time for questions." I smirked and pulled out a thick stack of documents, holding them up for everyone to see. "I just need clarification on one thing. When you ordered the demolition of my mansion, were you aware that it was a federally protected historic landmark?" Silence. Karen's face stiffened. Then, she forced a laugh. "A historic landmark? Don't be ridiculous. If that were true, why didn't you inform the HOA?" I locked eyes with her and replied calmly, "I didn't have to. It's protected by law." And as of this morning, the Department of Justice has launched an official investigation into the illegal destruction of a federally protected property. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Karen's expression twisted into panic. She quickly turned to the other HOA board members, but they immediately started distancing themselves from her. Because they knew this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore, this was a federal crime. Karen stammered, "Why, you're threatening me?" I leaned in close and whispered, "No, Karen. I'm just giving you a heads up so you have time to hire a lawyer." Less than 24 hours later, federal agents arrived at the HOA office, armed with arrest warrants. Karen was handcuffed in front of the entire neighborhood. "Mrs. Thompson, you are under arrest for destruction of federal property, fraud, and abuse of power." She screamed and struggled. "I'm the HOA president. You can't do this." No one cared. A few weeks later, her trial began. Karen was sentenced to 9 years in prison for fraud, destruction of a national landmark, and illegal property seizure. She was ordered to pay $15 million in damages to restore my mansion. The entire HOA board was removed from power, and their assets were seized. Evergreen Estates HOA was permanently dissolved. On the day Karen was taken away in cuffs, I stood at the courthouse steps, watching. "You'll regret this, Winters," she spat, eyes full of rage. I smirked and responded, "No, Karen. The only one who will regret anything is you. 9 years from now, when you walk out of prison broke and forgotten, you'll realize you lost everything." As she was shoved into the police van, I turned and walked away, lighter than I had felt in years. With the $15 million in damages, I rebuilt my mansion, restoring it to its original beauty. With the HOA gone, the neighborhood finally felt free. Residents celebrated the downfall of the tyrannical HOA, and from that day forward, Evergreen Estates became a true community, free from oppression. One reporter asked me, "Do you regret going to war with the HOA?" I smiled and looked at my newly restored mansion. I didn't just reclaim my home. I reclaimed justice for every homeowner they oppressed. Fire the HOA thought they could destroy me, but in the end, I destroyed them. Fire. Karen was arrested in front of the entire community, but that was only the beginning. Her trial became a national spectacle. It was all over the news, from local TV stations to national headlines. No one could believe that a suburban HOA had managed to demolish a federally protected landmark so blatantly. Karen faced 3 major charges: destruction of federal property, a felony carrying up to 10 years in prison, forgery and fraud, for faking legal documents to justify the demolition, abuse of power for financial gain, forcing homeowners to sell below market value so her husband's development company could buy them up. Karen entered the courtroom confident at first. But as the trial progressed, her arrogance faded. When the prosecution presented copies of the forged documents she had signed, her face turned pale. When the court played surveillance footage showing the HOA's demolition crew at work, she clenched her fists. When federal agents read out the landmark protection laws, she slammed her hand on the table and shouted, "I didn't know it was a landmark. This was a mistake." But ignorance wasn't a valid excuse. The prosecutor turned to her and asked, "If you didn't know it was a landmark, why did you forge the demolition approval?" Karen froze. Silence filled the courtroom. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She knew she had lost. Karen's trial didn't just bring her down, it exposed the entire corrupt HOA system. One by one, her allies betrayed her to save themselves. The HOA vice president admitted that Karen had pressured at least 5 families to sell their homes at a loss, using fines to force them into debt. The HOA secretary revealed that Karen took bribes from her husband's real estate firm, allowing them to redevelop parts of the neighborhood. A former HOA employee leaked emails showing that Karen had planned my mansion's demolition weeks before, even though there was no legal basis for it. Karen was completely abandoned. After 3 weeks of trial, the judge delivered the final verdict. Karen was sentenced to 9 years in prison for fraud, illegal property destruction, and financial misconduct. She was ordered to pay $15 million in damages, money that would go into rebuilding my mansion. The HOA was permanently dissolved, and all its assets were seized. Former board members were stripped of their HOA privileges, meaning they could never run another homeowners association again. The day Karen was escorted out of the courthouse, I stood on the steps, watching. She turned to me, her face twisted in rage. "You'll regret this, Winters." I smiled calmly. "No, Karen. The only one who will regret anything is you. 9 years from now, when you walk out of prison broke, forgotten, and powerless, you'll know exactly what you lost." She screamed and struggled as officers pushed her into the police van. I turned away, feeling lighter than I had in years. Winning against Karen wasn't enough. I wanted to make sure every homeowner she had wronged was made whole. I used part of the $15 million settlement to white heavy check mark restore my mansion to its original historic design, down to the last carved pillar and stained glass window. White heavy check mark buy back the homes that Karen forced people to sell and return them to their rightful owners. White heavy checkmark fund legal aid for homeowners fighting corrupt HOAs across the country. When I handed the Kaplan family the keys to their home, Mrs. Kaplan burst into tears. We never thought we'd see this house again. The Millers were next. Karen had forced them into foreclosure over a supposed landscaping violation. Now, they were moving back into their home. I still can't believe you did this, Stephanie Miller said as we carried her furniture inside. Most people would have just moved away. I smiled and replied, I'm not most people. As I went through the HOA's financial records, I found something shocking. Karen wasn't just targeting random homes. She had a larger plan. Her endgame was to force out enough homeowners so that her husband's real estate firm could rezone the entire neighborhood for commercial use. If she had succeeded, Evergreen Estates would have been turned into a business district, with high-rise condos and shopping centers. She wasn't just greedy. She was planning to erase the entire community. One day, the detective investigating Karen's case called me. We've made the arrests, he said. But we're also finding other victims. Karen was involved in HOA corruption in multiple neighborhoods. I looked out at my newly restored mansion. How did no one stop her before? I asked. Because people were afraid, the detective replied. They didn't know how much power they really had. I had changed that. And I wasn't done yet. I rebuilt my mansion bigger and stronger than ever. I made one major change. Police car light. I installed a massive plaque in front of my home that read, Police car light, National Historic Landmark, protected under federal law. Never again would anyone dare touch it. Without an HOA, some homeowners were worried about how the neighborhood would function. I proved to them. Backhand index pointing right, we didn't need a corrupt HOA. We could manage the community ourselves. Backhand index pointing right, we formed a volunteer-based neighborhood council. No power-hungry board, no fines, just homeowners looking out for each other. The result? Evergreen Estates thrived. No more violation notices. No more Karen with a clipboard terrorizing neighbors. For the first time in years, people were free. Karen's downfall became national news, but I knew there were thousands of other HOAs abusing their power just like hers. Rocket. I launched a non-profit, Justice for Homeowners, helping others fight corrupt HOAs. Rocket. I hired top lawyers to represent homeowners in legal battles. Rocket. I worked with lawmakers to push for new laws limiting HOA power. The result? Hundreds of corrupt HOAs across the country were investigated. States passed new laws restricting HOA authority. Thousands of families were freed from abusive HOA control. Karen thought she could destroy me. But in reality, she had just given me the power to destroy HOA corruption across the country. A year after the HOA's collapse, Evergreen Estates was thriving. I hosted a massive neighborhood barbecue, inviting everyone to celebrate the end of HOA tyranny. A reporter approached me. If you could say one thing to Karen now, what would it be? I smiled. Thank you. Thank her. The reporter looked confused. I nodded. If she hadn't destroyed my home, I never would have had the chance to destroy her entire HOA. Fire. The HOA thought they could ruin me. Instead, I erased them from history. Fire.